Hi there. In this video, I want us to start talking about Azure networking. And the basis for any Azure networking discussion is the virtual network. So I'm here inside of my portal, and let's start by going through a process for creating a new virtual network. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to our virtual networks area within the portal. I don't have any currently, so let's go through the process of creating a new one. Click on Add, and it's going to bring up our easy creation wizard. Now, this is a very straightforward wizard that is really just set up to create the basic virtual network. It's then going to be up to you to configure it however you see fit. So I'm going to do this VNet-101. I'm then going to give it a base address space of 10.0.0.0/24. Now, obviously, you can use whatever you want, but I highly recommend that you give it a private address space and something that is different from your on-prem address space, especially if you're going to connect the two together via a VPN, which I talk about in another video. The address spaces between your on-prem and public cloud virtual networks cannot overlap. You then choose, of course, the subscription that the VNet is going to go into. We also choose the resource group. I'm going to create a new one for this particular resource called Azure 101. We're then going to choose a regional location of the available regions that Azure provides to you. You're then going to give a default first subnet. A virtual network cannot be created without one subnet created along with it. So I'm just going to go ahead and leave the name as default, and then I'm going to give the address space of 10.0.0.0/27 to only carve out 32 or so addresses within the given virtual network's address space. We then choose whether we want to turn on DDoS protection, that's DDoS protection, or denial of service protection. Basic is available for all customers for free, but if you need some additional protection, which you can find out in the DDoS documentation, then you can choose standard. I'm, of course, going to leave it as basic. The next two items are additional service capabilities that can tie into your virtual network. One of them is service endpoints, which allows you to connect PaaS-based services or platform as a service-based services and actually privatize them within the scope of your virtual network. So that even though, for example, a Azure SQL server has a publicly available domain name, you can actually lock it down so that only the VMs or other resources within the scope of this virtual network can access it. I'm going to go ahead and enable it so that we can actually take a look at that within our virtual network configuration. You can then also choose which specific services can be available within this virtual network. So yes, you can turn on service endpoints, but you don't necessarily have to connect every single type of service. I'm going to go ahead and select all. We can then also select service endpoint policies. I don't have any created, so therefore 0 are selected. We can talk about that later. Then in addition, you can also enable the Azure Firewall, which is a managed network security service that protects your virtual network resources. You can think of it as a WAF, a web application firewall. That's not 100% accurate. It is closer to a more sessionless-based service, security service, but it does provide a firewall service to your virtual network and other virtual networks from a shared service rather than you having to deploy an individual WAF inside of the scope of your virtual network. The Azure Firewall actually gets hit first before traffic ever enters your virtual network. So think about it from that perspective of where do you want your security boundary to be? Do you want it to be inside the virtual network or outside the virtual network? Let's go ahead and click Create. And then after the process is created, we will go ahead and take a look at all of the configuration options for this virtual network. We'll go ahead and click on Go to Resource. Now, the top area is the same for all resources, so I'm not going to cover that. the overview page, the activity log or auditing, your access control for this particular virtual network, any tags, and then diagnosing of problems. The next areas are the primary configuration points for this virtual network. You can actually take a look at the address space that you chose. You can also modify or add additional address spaces. And when I say modify, I'm meaning you're modifying the virtual network. You actually cannot modify a existing address space for a virtual network. The Azure Resource Manager will not allow for that, but you can add additional address spaces. So I can actually, for example, 10.1.0.0/24 and give myself an additional 256 addresses. As soon as I click on save, I now have both of those sets of address spaces to leverage within the scope of my virtual networks. The connected devices area is just a way for you to see what actual resources are a part of this virtual network, have taken up one of the addresses in those address spaces. So you would see any NIC card, for example, that was associated with a virtual machine. You would see any load balancers or application gateways that are part of this virtual network. The next is then clicking on the subnets, and this is where we can add additional carvings of those address spaces that I created. Now, I want to point out here at the top that you'll see that there are two add buttons. One for a regular subnet, just like the one that we created during the initial installation process, and a gateway subnet. This is a reserved type of subnet that is only used when connecting with VPN gateways. Any traffic that is coming from on-prem via any kind of VPN gateway, whether it's a site-to-site, an IPsec tunnel, or it's an express route dedicated circuit, the initial traffic entry point for this virtual network will be the gateway subnet. So and you're only allowed one gateway subnet per virtual network. The next is the Ddos protection. Once again, just turning it from basic to standard and so on. The next is the Azure Firewall. We do not have an existing Azure Firewall service, but this is where you would associate an existing Azure Firewall implementation with this virtual network. And of course, inside of that Azure Firewall service is where you would configure it. I have done a separate video, or will do a separate video, depending upon when you're watching this, for that particular service. Next is security. And this is where you actually immediately go into Azure Security Center and see security-related information pertaining to your virtual network that you happen to be working with. So needless to say, this is an area that you're really only going to work with once the virtual network has been populated and is leveraged on a regular basis. But this does give you a very quick overview of some of the security recommendations related to your virtual network without you having to go all the way into Security Center. The next is DNS servers, and this is where you can actually provide DNS-based capabilities for all of the resources within the scope of this virtual network. Now, by default, Azure will take care of it for you, but that is a very limited set of DNS capabilities. Azure is going to dynamically generate the DNS entries for each individual resource inside of the virtual network. If you want to have a tighter control, then you can either leverage the Azure DNS service, which is a platform-based DNS service, or you can install and create your own virtual machine that provides DNS capabilities. Next is Peerings, and this is where you can actually hook together multiple VNets, whether they're in the same region or different regions, doesn't matter, so that they look like the same VNet within the scope of the resources within them, making the traffic flowing from a VM in VNet 1 to a VM in VNet 2 much, much easier, reduces the routing requirements for you as a customer, and Azure takes on that responsibility. As I said, these VNet peerings can occur either in the same region or across regions. However, not all regions are available for VNet peering yet. Make sure you check the documentation to see which ones have been turned on. The next and last one is service endpoints, and this is where we would actually connect in PaaS-based services such as Azure Cosmos DB, Azure SQL, Azure Storage, and so on, and make them available as privatized platform services within the scope of this VNet. Therefore, only the virtual machines, the load balancers, and so on would actually be able to talk to those particular services. Properties and locks are the standard across all resources, as is the export template. Then we have an area for monitoring where you can actually get some monitoring information dedicated to this virtual network, such as doing a connection monitor where you're actually looking at traffic that's flowing from one VM to another, or one VM to an external endpoint, to validate that the traffic is flowing the way that you expect it to within the scope of this virtual network. And then you can also get access to a diagram of the virtual network and all of the resources within, so that you can see how they are connected or interconnected depending upon how you've deployed everything. So that's pretty much it within the scope of a virtual network. Hopefully this gives you a good overview. Needless to say, this is just the base. There are many, many other services that are part of Azure networking, and I will talk about those at a 100 level as well in other videos. Thank you very much.